The Boeing 777's cabin lights flickered twice before failing completely. In the darkness, oxygen masks dropped like yellow phantoms, swaying in the sudden turbulence that sent coffee cups sliding across tray tables. The intercom crackled with controlled panic as Captain Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced catastrophic hydraulic failure. If there are any pilots aboard, military or civilian, please identify yourself to the crew immediately." In row 6, middle seat, Major Valentina Ghost Reyes stirred from her nap, her weathered flight jacket bunched behind her head as a makeshift pillow. 20 years of combat aviation had trained her to sleep through almost anything. Artillery fire in Kandahar, midnight scrambles over the Persian Gulf, the bone-rattling turbulence of a C-130 threading through mountain passes. But something in Morrison's voice, that particular strain of professional fear, pulled her instantly awake. Her hand instinctively reached for the worn patch on her jacket, the grinning skull emblem of the 64th Fighter Squadron. Aggressors. Beneath it, the call sign that had followed her through 3 wars. Ghost. The businessman beside her was hyperventilating into the oxygen mask, his manicured fingers white-knuckled on the armrest. Across the aisle, a mother clutched her teenage son, whispering prayers in Spanish, words Valentina recognized from her grandmother's lips decades ago. The aircraft lurched again, a sickening roll to starboard that sent loose items cascading through the cabin. Through the window, she could see the right engine trailing smoke, a thin black line against the pale morning sky somewhere over the Pacific. Valentina's mind was already calculating altitude, distance to nearest landfall, fuel consumption with one engine compromised. The 777 wasn't her bird. She'd spent 2 decades in F-16 Vipers, dancing on the edge of physics at Mach 2. But physics was physics, and death was death, whether you met it at 30,000 feet in a fighter jet or a commercial airliner packed with 287 souls who'd simply wanted to get home for Thanksgiving. She unbuckled her seatbelt with the same methodical precision she'd used before 100 combat missions, the muscle memory of pre-flight checks flooding back despite the 3 years since her medical discharge. The flight attendant stumbling down the aisle looked barely old enough to drink, mascara streaming down her cheeks as she tried to maintain composure. When Valentina stood, the attendant's eyes locked onto the military patches covering her jacket, not just the aggressors, but the weathered insignia of campaigns most civilians couldn't pronounce. "Major Valentina Reyes, United States Air Force," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient terror with battlefield clarity. 4,000 hours in fast jets. Tell Morrison he's got help coming." The attendant's relief was palpable, but Valentina was already moving toward the cockpit, her mind shifting into the cold calculation of emergency procedures, leaving behind the woman who'd been sleeping peacefully, heading home to Nevada, trying to forget the sky that had once been her kingdom and prison both. The cockpit door was already opening when she reached it, First Officer Chen practically pulling her inside. The instrument panel was a constellation of warning lights, red and amber indicators that painted a grim picture. Captain Morrison, gray-haired and steady-handed despite the situation, glanced back at her with the quick assessment of one professional sizing up another. "Military?" he asked, though her bearing had already answered. "Viper driver, 20 years." She was already scanning the instruments, her trained eye catching the hydraulic pressure gauges all reading 0. "How long since failure?" 6 minutes. We've lost all 3 hydraulic systems, unprecedented. Can't explain it. Controls are barely responding, using differential thrust to maintain heading." Morrison's hands were steady on the yoke, but she could see the strain in his shoulders. "We're 200 miles from Midway Atoll. That's our only shot." Valentina knew Midway, had landed there once during a Pacific exercise, the tiny atoll's runway a ribbon of concrete in an endless ocean. It was built for military aircraft, not wide-bodies. The approach would be like threading a needle while wearing boxing gloves, assuming they could even maintain control that long. Your flight management system's still working. She was already reaching for the backup radio muscle memory, guiding her fingers to frequencies she hadn't used in years. Partially, what are you thinking? I'm thinking we need help from people who speak my language. She keyed the military emergency frequency, her voice resuming the clipped, professional tone that had once coordinated airstrikes. Any station, any station. This is Ghost on guard. I'm aboard civilian heavy Boeing 777, November 947 Alpha, declaring emergency. Position approximately 200 miles bearing 090 from Midway. Request immediate vector and crash recovery standby. The response came within seconds. Hickam Air Force Base, Hawaii. The controller's voice was young but trained, recognizing the military terminology cutting through civilian airspace. Ghost, Hickam Control. Confirm you are aboard civilian aircraft. Affirmative, Hickam. Major Valentina Reyes, retired, aboard as passenger. Aircraft has experienced total hydraulic failure. I'm assisting civilian crew. We need everything you've got, whether at Midway, runway conditions, and I need you to patch me through to any Viper drivers you've got airborne. We're going to need some eyes on this bird. Morrison glanced at her with surprise and growing respect. The first officer was wrestling with the throttles, trying to counteract a gradual roll. Outside, the Pacific stretched endlessly, its surface deceptively calm from this altitude. Ghost, Hickam. Weather at Midway is marginal, 15-knot crosswind, scattered clouds at 2,000. Runway is 9,700 feet. Be advised, that's tight for a heavy. We're scrambling 2 F-22s from Hickam to provide escort and damage assessment. 9,700 feet. Valentina had landed Vipers on shorter strips, but a 777 needed nearly 8,000 feet on a good day, with functioning brakes and reversers. Without hydraulics, they'd have limited braking, no steering, and minimal control surface authority. Chen's voice was tight. We're not going to make Midway, not like this. Valentina studied the instruments, her mind racing through options. In combat, there was always another move, another angle. Morrison, you ever hear of the Gimli glider? Air Canada 767 that ran out of fuel, landed on a drag strip. Right, lost all hydraulics too. They used gravity and differential thrust. It's possible. She turned to Chen. You're going to need to reprogram your descent profile. We'll need to come in steep, bleeding energy. It's going to feel wrong. Every instinct you have will scream against it. You've done this before, Morrison asked. Not in anything this big, but the physics don't change. Lift, drag, thrust, weight. It's just math with consequences. The radio crackled again. Ghost, this is Raptor 2-1, flight of 2 F-22s. We're 15 minutes out. What's your situation? She recognized the voice, Captain Thompson, someone she'd trained years ago when he was fresh out of flight school. The universe had a sense of humor. Tommy, it's been a while. We've got a Boeing with no hydraulics trying to find a runway. Could use some eyes on our control surfaces. Major Reyes, holy. Ma'am, will be your wingman just like old times. Just like old times. Except in the old times, she'd been strapped into an ejection seat with a parachute and a prayer. Now, she had 286 other lives depending on whatever magic she could pull from her 2 decades of cheating death in aluminum tubes. Morrison was fighting the controls now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cockpit. We're starting to Dutch roll. Can't stop it with rudder. We don't have rudder. Valentina had seen Dutch roll in simulators, the aircraft beginning to oscillate in a sickening combination of yaw and roll that could quickly become unrecoverable. In a fighter, you could power through it. In an airliner. Chen throttled back on engine 1 20%. She was gambling now, using thrust differentials to counteract aerodynamic forces. Morrison, let it roll. Don't fight it. We're going to ride it out. The next minutes stretched like hours. The aircraft bucked and rolled, passengers screaming in the cabin behind them. But slowly, incrementally, the oscillations dampened. Chen's eyes were wide with something between terror and admiration. How did you know that would work? I didn't. Valentina's hands were steady as she adjusted the radio again. But I've been dancing with death for 20 years. You learn to lead. Through the windscreen, she could see the first hint of contrails, the raptors approaching at altitude, their swept wings catching sunlight. In her peripheral vision, Morrison's hands trembled slightly on the controls, and she understood. He was a good pilot, probably great, but he'd spent his career following procedures, trusting systems. She'd spent hers knowing that sometimes the only system that mattered was the one between your ears and your hands. Hickam Ghost, request you clear all traffic around Midway. This is going to get sporty. Copy Ghost, the airspace is yours. Emergency equipment is standing by. Standing by to collect pieces, she didn't say. Through the window, the raptors had formed up on their wing, close enough that she could see the pilots' helmets in the cockpits. One of them rocked his wings, the old fighter pilot salute. She found herself smiling grimly. If this was how it ended, at least she'd have an honor guard. But she wasn't ready for it to end. Not yet. Not with a cabin full of people who just wanted to see their families again. She'd been called Ghost because of her ability to appear and disappear in combat, to be everywhere and nowhere. Today, she'd need to be something else entirely, a bridge between the living and the dying, between the possible and the impossible. "All right, gentlemen," she said to Morrison and Chen, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd issued orders under fire. "Let's go flying." The Pacific stretched out below them, vast and indifferent. Somewhere ahead lay a speck of land with a strip of concrete that might as well have been the eye of a needle. Behind them, 286 souls breathed recycled air and prayed to whatever gods they knew. And in the cockpit, a woman who'd been trying to forget the sky prepared to remember everything it had taught her about survival. Morrison keyed the intercom, his voice steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our approach to Midway Atoll. It's going to be bumpy, but we have one of America's finest pilots assisting us. Please follow all crew instructions." One of America's finest. Valentina almost laughed. 3 years ago, the Air Force had grounded her, medical discharge for accumulated injuries, compressed vertebrae from too many high-G maneuvers, hands that trembled on bad days from nerve damage. They'd called her unfit to fly. Today, she was the only thing standing between these people and the Pacific Ocean. Chen was already calculating their descent rate, his fingers flying over the flight management computer. "We'll need to lose altitude aggressively. This isn't going to be comfortable." "Comfort's for peacetime," Valentina replied, then keyed her radio. "Raptor 2-1, can you give me a visual on our control surfaces? I need to know what's actually responding." The F-22 slid closer, its pilot's voice cracking through the radio. "Ghost, your rudder's barely moving. Maybe 5 degrees deflection. Elevators are sluggish but responding. Ailerons. You've got about 30% on the left, maybe 20 on the right." 20%. In her Viper, that would have been grounds for immediate ejection. Here, it would have to be enough. "Copy, Raptor. Stay close. I might need you to be my eyes if things get squirrely." Morrison glanced at her. "Squirrely, that's a technical term." "It is now." She was already visualizing the approach, seeing it like a 3-dimensional chess game. "Chen, I need you to program a combat descent profile. We're going to come in high and hot, then dump energy in the final turn." "That's not in any manual I've ever read." "No, but it's in mine." She pulled out her phone, surprising both pilots, and showed them a video, grainy footage of an F-16 performing an overhead brake, spiraling down from altitude in a tight descending turn. "We're going to modify this for our wounded bird. It's going to pull some GS, but it'll get us down." The businessman from row 6 would later tell reporters that the descent felt like riding a roller coaster, designed by someone who hated humanity. Children would cry. Adults would pray. Several would lose their breakfast into the convenient bags provided by the forward-thinking airline. But Valentina would orchestrate it with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of chaos. Every throttle adjustment, every slight input to the crippled control surfaces, building toward the moment of truth. The Midway runway grew from a theoretical concept to a thin line on the horizon to a rapidly approaching reality. "Gear down," Morrison commanded, and they all held their breath until 3 green lights confirmed the landing gear had deployed and locked. One system that still worked, a small mercy in a day running short on them. Ghost Midway Tower. Winds are gusting to 20 knots. Runway is clear. Crash trucks are positioned. Copy Tower. Valentina's voice was ice calm, but her mind was calculating physics problems that would have given her academy instructors nightmares. "Morrison, when we touch down, you're going to want to reverse engines immediately, but only to 50%, any more and we'll yaw off the runway with no steering." 50%, copy. They were 5 miles out now, lined up with the runway but still too high. In the cabin, flight attendants were calling out their final instructions, voices professional despite the fear. Through the cockpit door, Valentina could hear them. "Brace, brace, brace." She thought of all the combat missions that had ended with her touching down on a darkened runway, canopy cracked, aircraft riddled with holes but still flying. She thought of her squadron mates who hadn't made it back, whose names were etched on a wall at the academy. She thought of her grandfather, who'd flown B-17s over Germany and told her that every landing you walked away from was a good one. 3 miles, still too high, Chen reported, his voice tight. "I've got it." Valentina reached over and pulled the speed brake handle, a move that would have been suicide with full hydraulic failure, but with their partial control, it might just work. The aircraft shuddered, nose dropping, speed bleeding off in a controlled fall that felt anything but controlled. "Jesus Christ," Morrison muttered, his knuckles white on the yoke. "He's busy, you've got me instead." The runway was rushing up now, threshold lights blazing in the morning sun. 100 feet, 50, 30. The main gear kissed the concrete with a chirp that would have made any airline's training manual proud. Morrison slammed the thrust reversers to 50%, and the aircraft began to slow. But without steering, they were drifting, the nose wheel shimming as it tried to track straight. Hold it," Valentina chanted, her hands shadowing Morrison's on the controls, feeling the aircraft through 30 years of muscle memory. "Let it drift. The wind will push us back." They used every inch of those 9,700 feet. When the 777 finally came to rest, its nose wheel was 6 feet from the runway's end, staring at an equipment road and then the ocean beyond. For a moment, the cockpit was silent except for the spinning down of engines and the tick of cooling metal. Then the cabin erupted in cheers and sobs. Morrison pulled off his headset and turned to Valentina, his eyes wet. "I've been flying for 30 years. That was impossible." "No," she replied, finally allowing her hands to tremble. "Impossible was my 3rd tour in Afghanistan when I had to land a Viper with half a wing missing. This was just Tuesday." Chen actually laughed, a sound caught between hysteria and relief. The radio was chaos, voices congratulating them, requesting status, coordinating emergency vehicles. Through the windscreen, she could see the Raptors making a low pass, victory rolls against the morning sky, the fighter pilot's way of saying, "Well done." It would be 20 minutes before the mobile stairs arrived, before the passengers could disembark onto the tarmac of Midway Atoll. 20 minutes of sitting in that cockpit, the 3 of them processing what had just happened. Morrison would later tell the investigation board that Major Reyes had saved every life on board. Chen would write a letter to the Air Force, suggesting they reconsider their medical discharge policies. But Valentina would slip away before the media arrived, before the photographers and reporters could turn her into a headline. She'd learned long ago that the best operations were the ones nobody talked about. Ghost, they'd called her, for good reason. 3 hours later, she was sitting in Midway's tiny terminal, waiting for another aircraft to continue her journey home. Her phone buzzed with messages. Her old squadron mates had already heard, the military aviation community being smaller than civilians realized. One message stood out from General Patricia Hayes, her former wing commander. Heard you decided to fly again. About damn time. A small girl, maybe 7, approached her with her mother trailing behind. The girl held out a piece of paper and a crayon. My mom says you're the pilot who saved us. Can I have your autograph? Valentina looked at the paper, then at the child's wide eyes. The same age she'd been when she'd first looked up at the sky and decided that was where she belonged. She took the crayon and wrote her name, then added something else. Her wings, the same ones she'd drawn on notebooks 30 years ago, dreaming of flight. What's your name? Valentina asked. Sophie. Well, Sophie, do you want to know a secret? The girl nodded eagerly. The sky isn't scary, it's just another place to be brave. The mother mouthed, "Thank you," over her daughter's head, and they walked away. Valentina watched them go, then looked out the window at the recovered 777, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators. In a few hours, the incident would be international news. The airline would credit the crew's professionalism. The Air Force would quietly review her medical discharge. But right now, in this moment, she was just a woman sitting in a plastic chair in the middle of the Pacific, coming to terms with a truth she'd been running from for 3 years. She wasn't done with the sky, and it wasn't done with her. Her phone rang, unknown number. Major Reyes, this is Colonel Anderson at Air Combat Command. We've been monitoring the situation. Impressive work. Just doing what needed doing, sir. Indeed. Listen, I'm calling because we have a situation. Your medical discharge. There might have been some flexibility we didn't explore. Interested in discussing options. She looked at her reflection in the terminal window. Older, scarred, weathered by wars most people only saw on the news. But behind those eyes was the same fire that had carried her through flight school, through combat, through 100 moments when the margin between life and death was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. Sir, with all due respect, I just landed a broken 777 on a glorified parking lot in the middle of the Pacific. I think we're past discussing options. Anderson laughed. Fair point. How does instructor duty sound? We could use someone with your particular skills teaching our young pilots that sometimes the book doesn't have all the answers. Valentina thought about all the eager young pilots she'd trained, the ones who thought flying was about speed and glory rather than the moment-to-moment choice to keep defying gravity. They needed to know what she knew, that the sky was unforgiving but honest, that it would kill you for the smallest mistake but reward the prepared with views of eternity. When do I start? There's a C-17 heading to Edwards in 6 hours. Be on it. Edwards Air Force Base, where test pilots turned the impossible into routine, where she'd first earned her call sign, disappearing into the sun during a mock dogfight, reappearing on her opponent's 6 like a ghost. It felt like coming full circle. The sun was setting now, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere over that ocean, 286 people were telling their loved ones about the worst flight of their lives, about the woman in the leather jacket who appeared when they needed her most. They'd tell the story at dinner parties and family gatherings, each time making it a little more dramatic, a little less real. But Valentina knew the real story. It wasn't about heroism or spectacular flying. It was about a woman who'd forgotten who she was finding herself in the crucible of necessity. It was about the brotherhood of aviation, where a voice on the radio could be your lifeline, and where 20 years of experience could be distilled into a single moment of decision. She stood up, shouldering her bag with its worn patches and faded glory. The C-17 wouldn't leave for hours, but she wanted to watch the sunset from the flight line. Tomorrow, she'd be back in uniform, back in the sky, teaching young pilots that flying wasn't about conquering the air. It was about understanding it, respecting it, and occasionally, when lives hung in the balance, negotiating with it. As she walked across the tarmac, the F-22s were taking off for their return to Hickam, their afterburners painting stripes of fire against the darkening sky. The lead pilot waggled his wings as he passed, a salute from one warrior to another. She raised her hand in response, a gesture seen by no one but meaning everything. Ghost was going home, not to Nevada, not to retirement, but to the sky where she belonged. And this time, she wouldn't forget why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Not for the speed or the danger, but for moments like today, when the impossible became possible through skill, determination, and the unbreakable bond between those who'd chosen to slip the surly bonds of Earth. Behind her, the damaged 777 sat like a wounded bird, testament to a miracle that wasn't really a miracle at all. Just physics, experience, and a woman who'd refused to let death win. The investigators would study it for months, trying to understand how 3 hydraulic systems could fail simultaneously. They'd write reports, implement new procedures, add another chapter to the ever-growing manual of aviation safety. But they'd miss the real lesson, that in the end, when all the systems fail and the procedures run out, what matters is the human in the loop. The one who looks at chaos and sees patterns, who feels the aircraft's pain through the stick and throttle, who brings everyone home because that's what pilots do. The radio in the terminal crackled with routine traffic, flights checking in, weather updates, the mundane poetry of controlled airspace. Valentina smiled, remembering her first solo flight when that chatter had seemed like a foreign language. Now it was the soundtrack of her life, a rhythm she'd tried to forget but couldn't escape. 3 years ago, the Air Force had told her she was done. Today, she'd proved that some things don't end. They just pause, waiting for the right moment to resume. And as the first stars appeared over the Pacific, Major Valentina, Ghost, Reyes knew her moment had come. The story would make headlines around the world. Hero pilot saves 287 lives. Miracle over the Pacific. The ghost who came back. But those were just words, inadequate to capture the reality of those 37 minutes when death had seemed certain and one woman had said, "Not today." Tomorrow she'd face the cameras, the questions, the people who wanted to understand how she'd done it. She'd use words like training and experience, deflecting credit to Morrison and Chen, to the controllers at Hickam, to the F-22 pilots who'd been her eyes. She'd make it sound routine, professional, because that's what warriors did. They made the extraordinary seem ordinary, the impossible seem inevitable. But tonight, standing on the flight line at Midway, watching the stars emerge over the endless Pacific, she allowed herself one moment of pure truth. She'd missed this. The weight of responsibility, the clarity of purpose, the knowledge that her skills mattered in ways that couldn't be measured or replaced. A transport plane descended toward the runway, its lights blinking in the darkness. Soon, its passengers would disembark, never knowing how close they'd come to landing on a runway that might have been blocked by wreckage. They'd complain about the delay, the inconvenience of being diverted to Midway, never understanding that their minor irritation was someone else's salvation. That was the nature of disaster prevented. It became invisible, a non-event, a story that began with almost and ended with but didn't. Only those who'd been inside it knew the weight of those words, the infinite distance between almost and didn't. The transport touched down smoothly, its pilots executing a textbook landing on the same runway that had nearly been too short, too narrow, too impossible just hours before. Valentina watched its lights taxi toward the terminal and thought about all the flights that would land here in the coming years, their pilots never knowing that today, this runway had been an altar where physics and faith had met and somehow found common ground. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Sophie's mother. She says she wants to be a pilot now. Thank you for showing her it's possible. Possible? Such a small word for such a vast concept. Today, she'd made the impossible possible through nothing more than refusing to accept the alternative. Tomorrow, she'd teach young pilots that the sky wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and flying anyway, about trusting your training when your instincts screamed, about bringing everyone home because that was the only acceptable outcome. The C-17 crew would arrive soon, and she'd board that aircraft as a passenger one last time. But when she landed at Edwards, she'd step off as an instructor, ready to pass on the lessons that couldn't be found in any manual. That courage wasn't the absence of fear but action in its presence, that the sky was both adversary and ally, and that sometimes the most important moment of your life came disguised as just another Tuesday. As she walked toward the terminal, she passed the 777 one more time. Maintenance crews were already swarming over it, beginning the long process of understanding what had gone wrong. But Valentina didn't look back. She'd learned long ago that you couldn't fly forward while looking behind. The stars were bright now, unmarred by city lights or clouds. Somewhere up there, satellites were recording data, tracking flights, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that made modern aviation possible. But beyond all that technology, beyond the systems and procedures and protocols, there was still just the fundamental act of human flight. One person, one machine, and the eternal negotiation with gravity. Ghost was ready to fly again, not because she had to, but because she finally understood that she'd never really stopped. The sky had always been there, waiting, patient as eternity and unforgiving as physics. And she'd always been its student, its challenger, its child who'd grown up to speak its dangerous language. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, young pilots who thought they knew everything, aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But tonight, under the stars at Midway, she was simply Valentina Reyes, a woman who'd found her way back to the only home she'd ever really known, that vast blue space between the Earth and eternity where humans had learned to fly. The C-17's engines were audible now, their distant rumble a promise of the journey ahead. She shouldered her bag one more time, feeling the weight of the patches, the history, the 1,000 flights that had brought her to this moment. Each step toward the terminal was a step toward tomorrow, toward the next generation of pilots who would need to know what she knew. The automatic doors opened with a soft hiss, welcoming her back to the world of departure lounges and boarding calls. But she wasn't a passenger anymore, not really. She was a teacher, a guardian, a keeper of the flame that had been passed from the Wright brothers through generations of pilots who'd refused to accept that humans belonged only on the ground. As she settled into a plastic chair to wait for her flight, she noticed a young airman watching her, his eyes wide with recognition. The story had already spread through military channels, the way stories did when they involved one of their own doing something impossible. "Ma'am, are you Major Reyes, the one who?" "I'm just someone waiting for a flight, airman." But she smiled when she said it, and he understood. Some stories were meant to be told in whispers, in ready rooms and officer clubs, growing larger with each telling until they became legend. He nodded and turned away, but she heard him on his phone moments later. "You're not going to believe who I just saw." Let them tell the story, she thought. Let it inspire or terrify or amaze. Stories were for the living. She had work to do, pilots to train, skis to fly. The ghost was going home, not to rest but to ensure that when the next impossible moment came, someone else would be ready to step forward and say, "I've got this." The Pacific night stretched endlessly beyond the terminal windows, full of stars and possibilities. Somewhere out there, hundreds of aircraft were tracing their paths through the darkness, their pilots trusting in training and technology to bring them safely home. Most would never face what she'd faced today, but for those who did, she'd make sure they were ready. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. C-17 transport to Edwards Air Force Base, now boarding all personnel. Major Valentina Ghost, Reyes stood, straightened her jacket with its combat patches and hard-won wings, and walked toward her future. Behind her, the damaged 777 sat in the darkness, a monument to what was possible when failure wasn't an option. Ahead lay Edwards and classrooms full of young pilots who needed to know that the sky wasn't conquered. It was negotiated, one flight at a time, one decision at a time, one heartbeat at a time. She boarded the aircraft without looking back. Ghosts, after all, didn't dwell on the past. They haunted the future.